How's it going tonight, everyone? Fantastic. If you were here last night, my name is Matthew Crowley. I am excited for tonight. The topics that Mr. Horton talks about is near and dear to my heart. Me being a veteran, and buddies I know that have been shipped off to war and that have come back, not in the same place that they were. It drove me to this party. It drove me to know about Mr. Horton and his works. But enough about me. The man who has written Fool's Errand, Time to End the War in Afghanistan, and his new book, Enough Already, Time to End the War on Terrorism, Mr. Scott Horton.
Hi, guys. Thanks for having me here tonight. You hear me okay? Is this thing on? Yeah. Thank you for coming. All right. I'm short. I'm going to fix this thing here. How about that? A little better. All right. So, the speech tonight is we have to end the war on terrorism. And that's the case I make in my new book, available now, Enough Already, Time to End the War on Terrorism. And I'm going to essentially make the case to you guys tonight that I make in the book. I better get my notes. I hope I have an hour. Do I have an hour? Okay. I should have checked. This is going to take a little bit. All right. So our story really in the book, and really for all intents and purposes, begins in the year 1979 in the Iranian Revolution. But of course, then that means we got to go back to 1953 and the Iranian coup. And the CIA overthrew the democratically elected government of Mohammad Mossadegh, the prime minister of Iran, in 1953, and reinstalled the Shah Reza Pahlavi, who was essentially a military dictator, sock puppet American dictator. And they kept him in power for 26 years. Then, in 1978 and 79, the Shah's government was falling apart. He was sick with cancer, and the government was going to fall, and there was no obvious replacement for him. And a broad-based revolution broke out across the country. And one thing that is not really secret, but is, as far as I can tell, almost never mentioned, is that the CIA and the State Department advised Jimmy Carter's government to go ahead and allow the to allow the Ayatollah Khomeini to come back to Iran from his exile in France. And I remember even as a kid wondering, I saw footage of the Ayatollah getting on the plane in Paris. And I remember thinking, well, but aren't the French our buddies? And why would they do that if that's not what the Americans wanted? And the answer is that is what the Americans wanted. The CIA said, we know this guy. He helped us overthrow Mossadegh back in 1953. He was part of a group of Shiite fundamentalists who protested and were essentially paid off to protest to help weaken the Mossadegh government back for the last coup. So we can deal with this guy. And now I was too young to remember, but some of you lived through this. But I've noticed that from talking to people that even people who were adults during this time often conflate and misremember and put the Iranian Revolution, which was actually in February of 1979, with the hostage crisis that didn't break out until November. And so for the entire year in 1979, the Jimmy Carter government was trying to get along with the Ayatollah's new regime. And they were passing him intelligence, warning about threats from the Russians and from the new dictator of Iraq, Saddam Hussein, who had just taken power in a coup that same year. And it wasn't until November that David Rockefeller, the chairman of the Chase Manhattan Bank, convinced Jimmy Carter to let the Shah into the United States for cancer treatment. That the people of Iran, or especially the radical students in Tehran, took that as a message that the Americans were going to try to cancel the revolution and reinstall the Shah again. And that was what led to the riot and the seizing of the hostages at the embassy where the last coup had been plotted. It's not to justify it, but it's just to explain the true context of that. Because what Americans remember about that time is the American flag being burned, and the Ayatollah pronouncing that America was the great Satan, and therefore this Shiite religious fundamentalism puts Iran necessarily at odds with the United States. But that wasn't the true history of what happened. First, it was a reaction against a dictator America had no right to install against them in the first place. Secondly, it was one that the Americans said, okay, go ahead and do your revolution because we don't really have a replacement anyway. And then third, it wasn't until Carter's political mistake of allowing the Shah into the US that led to the riot and canceled what had been an attempt to be friendly with the new government. Now, that same year, 1979, in July, Jimmy Carter signed a finding, that is, an order to the CIA to begin support for the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, who were fighting a civil war against the Soviet-backed communist regime in the capital city of Kabul. And the purpose of this support at the time is very interesting. In the aftermath of the Vietnam War, the American people had what our government and military establishment considered a mental illness. They called it Vietnam syndrome. The American people's reluctance to do that again after Korea and Vietnam and these terrible disasters with such high casualties and such consequences for the society back home. They didn't want to be involved in these proxy wars against communism anymore. And so the leaders in the military establishment and in the national security establishment decided, you know what we could do? Instead of containing communism, let's bait them into overexpansion, into, say, for example, a safe place like Afghanistan. We don't want them to roll into West Germany, but let's bait them into war in Afghanistan. You know what we'll do? We'll give them their own Vietnam. Since Vietnam was such a no-win destructive quagmire for the Americans that broke our bank and divided our society back home, what if we could bait the Soviets and trick them into doing that to themselves? And that was the purpose. Walter Slocum, Robert Gates, and Zbigniew Brzezinski all used that term at the time. We'll give them their own Vietnam was the purpose of it. Now, about 6 months later, Christmas 1979, the Soviets did invade. And I'll hasten to add that it doesn't really look like it was the American support for the Mujahideen that had succeeded in provoking them. Their own communist sock puppet dictator was really causing the civil war. And the first thing the KGB did when they arrived was take him out back and shoot him in the head and replace him. So that was really their problem. But the point remains that the Americans saw what they thought was the wisdom in baiting the Soviets into fighting the Afghan war to weaken the Soviets, to bog them down in a no-win war of attrition, in a quagmire against them. All right, then what happened though was when the Soviets invaded in Christmas '79, Jimmy Carter's government, which had deliberately provoked the thing, panicked and said, oh no, look, if the Soviets were to roll into Iran next, they would control the entire Persian Gulf. They could roll across Pakistan and seize the port of Karachi. We could be looking at a whole new massive development in Soviet power. And so Carter announced in his State of the Union address in 1980 the new Carter Doctrine. And the Carter Doctrine said that America is the dominant power in the Persian Gulf. It's hereby an American lake, and any attempt by any country to dominate the Persian Gulf would be treated as an attack upon the United States, as in we will go to war with the Soviet Union if they try to invade Iran. And so as part of that Carter Doctrine, they doubled down on their alliance with the Saudis, including beginning to put bases again in Saudi Arabia, which had been back in the 60s and had been withdrawn and were then replaced. And then they started putting in bases in Qatar, Bahrain, and UAE as well as the buildup. This is now where the Air Force headquarters is in the region, is in Qatar, and the Navy's Fifth Fleet is based in Bahrain. This is all legacy of the beginning of that Carter Doctrine. And as another major part of the Carter Doctrine, President Jimmy Carter gave the green light to Saddam Hussein to invade Iran. Now, Iraq had their own problem, well, Saddam Hussein specifically, and his Ba'athist dictatorship. They had their own problem with the Iranian Revolution, because Saddam Hussein is a Sunni, and was the ruler of a Ba'ath Party government that was dominated by Sunni tribes. Now, there were Christians and Shia and other groups that were part of the Ba'ath Party, but it was dominated by the Sunni minority, 20% of the population. A full 60% of the population, a supermajority of Iraqis are Shiites, and predominant in the land all the way from Baghdad down to Kuwait and east to Iran, other than in the very far north of the country are the Kurds, who are Sunnis but are Kurdish, not Arab. But anyway, so Hussein had a real worry that with the Shiite revolution breaking out in Iran, that the Shiites of Iraq might pick their religious sect over their national and ethnic sect as Iraqis and Arabs, and which was true. Some Iraqis were already crossing the border to go into Iran to participate in the revolution and were encouraging the Iranians to come into Iraq. And so Saddam Hussein decided he would preempt this by conscripting them all and sending them as human waves in battle against the Iranians. And in fact, the idea was it was going to be easy. You might have heard this one before about Middle Eastern wars. We're just going to march right in there and overthrow the Ayatollah. It's going to be fine. Well, in fact, that attack solidified the Ayatollah's power. At Georgetown University, they call it the rally around the flag effect. Same way Americans rallied around George W. Bush after September 11th. Independence first, and other political differences later. And so people rallied around the Ayatollah's government. It helped solidify their hold on power, and it led to a massive no-win quagmire war, World War I style, trenches and tanks, stalemate type of a war in the far east of Iraq and near the Iranian border that lasted throughout the 1980s. So when Ronald Reagan comes in, he does continue that same policy of support for Iraq, and including giving them intelligence, first of all, money to buy chemical weapons from our European allies, and then intelligence from American satellites to use to target Iranian forces in the field, who themselves were mostly a bunch of teenage conscripts. And it was the worst chemical warfare since World War I, including the use of sarin and Tabun nerve gas on the Iranians at the hands of the Reagan-Hussein conspiracy there. And he also doubled down on support for the Arab Afghan army, for the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. And to be specific, as this project progressed throughout the 1980s, it wasn't just the Afghan Mujahideen that the CIA was backing. In a project jointly with the Saudis and the Pakistanis, they were sending Islamist extremists from all around the world, especially the Arab world, but including as far as Chechnya, the Philippines, and the United States of America, where young Muslim men were going to join up to fight on the side of the Afghan Mujahideen against the Soviet Union. And Ayman al-Zawahiri, the current leader of al-Qaeda, and of course Osama bin Laden and their group were all part of that movement at the time, of what they called the Arab Afghan Army. Now, in the aftermath of the Iran-Iraq War, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in a dispute over war debts. And I've learned from giving the same speech a couple of times before, I do not have time to get into that. But the story's in the book, and suffice it to say, I don't think it was a deliberate entrapment job, but in effect, they entrapped Saddam Hussein and told him, look, you're welcome to invade Kuwait's northern oil fields. But then he decided, well, you like me so much, maybe I'll go all the way to the sea, which the Americans still really didn't care about, but the British did. And Margaret Thatcher and her government, they gave Bush what they called a backbone transplant and insisted that America go to war for British interests in Kuwait. And that was what that was primarily about. And once they started the build-up, Operation Desert Shield, they spent the second half of the year 1990 absolutely refusing to negotiate Iraq's exit from Kuwait, which Saddam made something like a dozen separate offers to negotiate his way out of there, including with the most paper, meaningless promises and face-saving with no real results intended at all, and it was not good enough. Once they drew that line and said this will not stand, they made sure to keep him there until they could get their forces ready to launch the war. And now, people remember Iraq War I as a short, sweet, successful war. Our space-age technology against their, aging, decrepit Soviet armored, tank divisions and so forth. And it was quick and easy. And when people, go over the history of all the terrible wars, even in Andrew Bacevich's column in the New York Times, he listed all the horrible wars since Vietnam, but Iraq War I somehow didn't make the list because I guess that one wasn't so horrible, right? Except the thing of it wasn't so quick and easy. One of the major consequences of the war was that when it ended, the Bush government encouraged the Shiite supermajority of the south and east of Iraq to rise up and overthrow Saddam Hussein, and the Kurds with them. And George Bush put out a statement over Voice of America radio, and the Air Force dropped leaflets that looked like Iraqi currency, so to make sure that people would pick them up, that said, now's your chance. And so they took that as support, that the Americans would support them in the overthrow. And America, at the time, of course, ruled the entire southern half of the country and had yet to withdraw after the war. And then, so they rose up, but then the Bush government changed their minds and left them high and dry to be slaughtered, more than 100,000 Iraqi Shiites and Kurds. And they let Saddam Hussein keep his tanks, or what he had left, and his attack helicopters in order to massacre them all. Well, why would they do such a thing? Well, it's the same reason that Saddam Hussein panicked and invaded Iran back in 1980. The Iranians were coming across the border to lead the revolution. And the Iraqis who had chosen Iran's side back in 1980, namely the Badr Brigade of the Supreme Islamic Council, was leading the charge. So in the Bush senior government, this was essentially Ronald Reagan's third term. These were all the same men from the Ronald Reagan administration who had backed Saddam Hussein really all the way up until the time that he invaded Kuwait. They were still transferring him weapons in the spring of 1990. And why were they doing that? The same policy they'd inherited since Carter, to contain the Iranian Revolution, right? And now what were they doing? Now they were importing it. And they said, oh no, and panicked and called it off and let 100,000 people be killed. And then came the crocodile tears. Oh no, that cruel Saddam Hussein, that Adolf Hitler, the way he slaughtered these people that we just set up and then left high and dry. Now we have to stay in our bases in Saudi Arabia in order to enforce our no-fly zone patrols over northern and southern Iraq in order to protect the Kurds and the Shiites that we just set up and betrayed. Now, the insurrection was over. It's not like Saddam Hussein was going to continue on killing every last Shiite and every last Kurd. The insurrection had been crushed, but this was the excuse. So the Americans, the British, and the French launched their no-fly zones. The French dropped out after a year or so, I guess, or maybe even less than that. But the Americans and the British kept this up throughout from the end of the Bush senior years and entirely all through the Bill Clinton years. Call it Iraq War 1.5. The insistence on the UN inspections regime looking for weapons of mass destruction that by 1995 they knew every last bit of it had been destroyed in 1991, but kept the pretext up. The sanctions regime, which was in fact a United Nations Security Council resolution, full-scale embargo, a global embargo that outlawed all private trade with Iraq. This starvation regime. In the Bush senior years and again in the Bill Clinton years, they reiterated that these sanctions will stay. Sometimes we call it weapons of mass destruction, but really these sanctions will stay until Saddam Hussein is removed from power. So what they're saying was, these people who had their chance to overthrow him when we told them to go for it and then stab them in the back and let him kill them all, now we're starving them until the point where they will become so desperate that they will risk everything to try again, now that they don't have a chance, now that their power in comparison to their dictatorship is completely out of scale and they have no chance whatsoever in doing it. But that was the excuse for the sanctions regime. That is essentially state terrorism. We will punish the civilian population until they comply by doing what is absolutely absurd and impossible, and everybody knows it. Getting rid of Saddam Hussein for us when they're in no position whatsoever to do so. Okay, then this is really what caused more than any other reason, this is what caused that Arab-Afghan army that Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan's governments had backed in Afghanistan against the Soviet Union to turn on the United States of America. Osama bin Laden had volunteered his men to oust Iraq from Kuwait and had been incensed that the king told him, no, I'm going to have the Americans do it. But then the king had at least promised, as soon as the war's over, Dick Cheney says that they're going to leave. But then they didn't leave. And bin Laden denounced King Fahd as a sellout and a traitor for allowing not just infidel businessmen with briefcases, but foreign combat troops, Christian combat forces stationed on the Arabian Peninsula. And so I'm a Texan. I think you guys can relate to this even if you're not from Texas. Say if you're from New York, you got West Point. In Texas, we have the Alamo. It's one of these sites where we would fight for it no matter what because of the history there and that kind of thing. Well, so now imagine if Jesus had been born at the Alamo. And it was not just the site of everything important to us in terms of land, but it was also like the origin of the religion that the supermajority of Americans follow and how important that land would be. So that's what the peninsula is to them. It's not just their homeland, it's their holy land, the land of Mecca and Medina. And the idea was that foreign combat forces are not allowed. Frankly, if the governor of Texas asked the Saudis to build a big military base in San Antonio, that wouldn't placate the people of San Antonio just because they had an invitation from the governor. We would consider that a problem, and we would probably shoot them until they left. And that's how they felt about us. And especially if they were using those bases to launch endless sorties against the people of Mexico and deliberately starving them to death and so forth. We would not put up with that. And that was essentially the position that America put their own former mercenary fighters is turning on the United States. And they started attacking us in 1990. The first one was the assassination of an American/Israeli rabbi named Rabbi Kahane, who advocated the mass expulsion of all of the Palestinians out of the West Bank and Gaza and the full takeover of all that land by Jewish Israelis. And they killed him in New York City in 1990. It was the same group that blew up the World Trade Center in 1993. And I have to add, the CIA intervened with the State Department and made sure these guys were allowed into the country. The founder of Egyptian Islamic Jihad, who was partners with Ayman al-Zawahiri, the current leader of al-Qaeda, was the blind sheikh, Omar Abdel Rahman. Well, the State Department didn't want to let him in. And the CIA said, he's cool, we know him from the war in Afghanistan. And so intervened to allow them into the country. Then a walk-in informant, a former Egyptian Army intelligence officer, came to the FBI and said, these guys want to blow up the World Trade Center. And they've recruited me to build the bomb. So all you need to do is pay me a little bit of money, and I will make sure we'll switch out the explosives with an inert powder and have a great sting. And the FBI agents, Floyd and Antisev were their names, tried to do their job, but their supervisor, Carson Dunbar, would not allow them to essentially pay this informant the 500 measly bucks a week that he needed and tried to force him to wear a wire when he's sleeping on the floor of the mosque with these guys and couldn't possibly wear a wire without getting busted by them. And so the guy dropped off the case, and then they brought in Ramzi Youssef, who built the bomb, who almost succeeded in toppling one tower over into the other, February of 1993. Luckily, 6 people were killed, but it was agreed by experts at the time if they'd only parked the truck closer to the wall instead of this column, they would have succeeded in toppling one tower over into the other. And so that was how the 1990s started. Then they attacked Americans at a hotel in 1992. I skipped that one. A hotel in Yemen in 92. Then the World Trade Center 93. Then in 1995, they attacked Americans training the Saudi National Guard. I think killed 2. And then in 1996, they bombed the Khobar Towers. You guys remember that one? 19 American airmen bombed. And it was Osama bin Laden and Khalid Sheikh Mohammed who did it. But guess what? Of course, the Saudis, with Bill Clinton and the FBI, decided to blame it on Iran. They blamed it on Iranian-backed Saudi Hezbollah, which is this tiny little group that was not the perpetrators of it. It was, and there's wide and varied sources now that show, and great journalism that shows, it was Al-Qaeda that did it. And the American people really got cheated out of the truth there. As 19 airmen was a very specific message. And if that had been the subject of a real public debate, that there are these right-wing religious fundamentalists in Saudi Arabia that want us the hell off of their land, and maybe we can do our patrols from aircraft carriers, and maybe we don't need to do it this way. That conversation wasn't held because they blamed it on the Iranians across the Gulf, said that they had taken a target of opportunity for no particular reason anyone could discern, and then forget about it. And so the story went nowhere. Then they bombed the embassies in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, and Nairobi, Kenya in the summer of '98. They tried to bomb a ship called the USS Sullivans, but luckily the dinghy sank in, I think, '99. And then in 2000, they bombed the USS Cole at port in Aden, Yemen. And they tried to bomb LAX, but the guy got caught at the Canadian border with Washington State. That was a real bin Ladenite plot. So then during all of this time that Al-Qaeda is attacking the United States, the Bill Clinton government is still being funny and funding them and backing them. For example, in Bosnia in the early 1990s, like 92 through 95, the Americans supported not just the Bosnian Muslims, but outright and admittedly, Richard Holbrooke himself admitted that they helped to transport the Afghan Mujahideen fighters, the Arab Afghans, to come and fight on the side of the Bosnian Muslims in the war against the Serbs. That's where Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the organizer of the September 11th attack, earned his stripes and credibility as a fighter on these guys' side. And then they also backed them in the wars in Chechnya. And what's funny is the official story, which I guess is true, is that Bill Clinton's government paid the entire cost of Russia's war against the terrorists in Chechnya. The CIA and the Saudis were also backing the Chechen terrorists against them, trying to prevent an oil pipeline from running from the Caspian Basin through Russian territory before it gets to Europe. And you read all about it in the Stratfor leak on WikiLeaks. They talk all about it. In fact, even the Washington Post admitted in depth the Saudi role, but omitted the American role that Stratfor does detail. And of course, the CIA was in on it all along. And then they also backed the Kosovo Liberation Army, of course, in the Kosovo War of 1999. And those guys were, to the gills, filled with Arab Afghan Mujahideen, the guys, veterans from the war in Afghanistan in the 1980s. And so, in other words, the Clinton government thought essentially that they would just be clever and continue to use these guys like it was the 1980s, as though they hadn't already been attacking American targets, as though they hadn't already come this close to knocking one tower over into the other midday, which could have killed 30,000 people. It doesn't take much imagination to see how dangerous this threat was. So the Clinton government just continued to back them anyway. And in fact, and I quote, I have the exact quotes. I think I just sort of skipped it in the new book, but in the first book, Fool's Errand, I have the exact quotes from Bill Clinton himself, and then his Democratic allies, Senator Tom Lantos and Representative Brad Sherman, all three of whom said after September 11th, "How dare these Muslims do this to us after all that we have done for them lately?" And because they had thought that somehow they had bought off the loyalty of these guys just because they were funding them and backing them in certain places. But the bases in Saudi Arabia were still there, and the support for the Middle Eastern dictatorships was still there. The pressure on them to ramp up production of oil, to drop the price, to subsidize our economy at their expense was still there. And support for Israel and their occupation of Palestine, and at that time, Lebanon, continued. And so the Democrats hadn't bribed anything. They'd done nothing but back an enemy that was still out to get them. And on the point about Israel there, I'll just give one important example of the role that support for Israel played in motivating Al-Qaeda to attack us. In 1996, Shimon Peres launched Operation Grapes of Wrath in southern Lebanon. And the day that he did so, a young engineering student from Cairo, Egypt, who was studying in Hamburg, Germany, named Mohammed Atta, filled out his last will and testament, which was essentially, representing his joining the army, his willingness to die in the fight against the enemy, in that case specifically Israel. And then just a couple of days later was what we now call the first Qana massacre, because it happened again in 2006. But in 1996, the Israelis bombed a United Nations shelter and killed 108 women and children. And it was right at this time that bin Laden was getting kicked out of Sudan and was landing in Afghanistan. And he put out his first declaration of war against the United States, called the Declaration of War Against the Americans Occupying the Two Holy Places. Pretty subtle, huh? Anyway, so about a quarter of that essay, you can read it on the PBS website, is about Operation Grapes of Wrath and the Qana massacre. And according to Terry McDermott in the book Perfect Soldiers, when bin Laden put out his declaration of war, that was when Mohammed Atta and his friend Ramzi bin al-Shibh decided that they wanted to make bin Laden's fight their fight. And that was when they traveled to Afghanistan to meet al-Qaeda and join al-Qaeda and be recruited essentially into the September 11th attack. And Mohammed Atta, of course, was the pilot of Flight 11 that hit the North Tower and is said to have been the ringleader in the United States of the plot. His partner, Ramzi bin al-Shibh, is languishing in Guantanamo Bay to this day. And that was their motive, was America's support for Israel's massacres in Lebanon, which is something that George W. Bush neglected to explain to us and our moms and our aunties back on September 11th. It was why they do this, but that's what it was. So then, obviously, the attack of September 11th came, and we talked about the motive of why al-Qaeda did it. It wasn't because we were free. It was because of American interventionist policies in the Middle East. But there's also this question of al-Qaeda's strategy for their war against the United States. John Miller, who was a CIA investigative reporter who then became an FBI agent for a while, I think he's retired now, but he went and interviewed bin Laden in 1998 in Afghanistan. And he later told the story to another writer that when he interviewed bin Laden said, "That's right, and that's why I'm declaring war against the United States." So here's this guy with a couple of hundred followers, essentially in exile in no man's land on the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan, as far as you could ever get from anywhere without being on your way back again, right? And he's saying that he's going to take on the USA, number one. And John Miller says, and I thought to myself, yeah, you and what army? But so then the joke is, of course, that the plan all along was to use the U.S. Army to accomplish all of al-Qaeda's goals for them. The same policy that Walter Slocum and Robert Gates and Zbigniew Brzezinski had discussed in trying to lure the Soviets into Afghanistan in 1979 was the same policy that al-Qaeda had for the United States, to lure us into Afghanistan, to replicate that war in order to bog us down, bleed us to bankruptcy, and force us out. That bin Laden taunted us and said that we were wimps and that we were a paper tiger and that if they hit us, we would times. That bin Laden taunted us and said that we were wimps and that we were a paper tiger and that if they hit us, we would turn around and run away. And so that means we must double, triple, quadruple down forever and ever and never leave, and that'll show them. But of course, that was why bin Laden said that, because it's pretty easy to taunt Brett Stevens. He's kind of a nerd. Him and Jeffrey Goldberg. So now, this quote is from 2010 when Osama bin Laden was still alive. This is his son, Omar. Now, you probably heard of Hamza bin Laden, who apparently was really a terrorist and supposedly Trump's government killed about a year and a half ago. But this is Omar bin Laden. He's an okay guy. And he left Afghanistan before the September 11th attack, and he gave this interview to Rolling Stone magazine, to Guy Lawson in Rolling Stone in Damascus, Syria in 2010. He said, "My father's dream was to bring the Americans to Afghanistan. He would do the same thing he did to the Russians. I was surprised the Americans took the bait. I so much respected the mentality of President Clinton. He was the one who was smart. When my father attacked his places, he sent a few cruise missiles after my father's training camp. He didn't get my father, but after all the war in Afghanistan, they still don't have my father. They have spent hundreds of billions. Better for America to keep the money for its economy. In Clinton's time, America was very smart, not like a bull that runs after the red scarf. I was in Afghanistan when Bush was elected. My father was so happy. This is the kind of president he needs, one who will attack and spend money and break the country. I'm sure my father wanted Senator John McCain more than Obama in the 2008 election. McCain has the same mentality as Bush. Now, this is obviously a very naive take on Bill Clinton and Barack Obama's policy, but he's judging on a curve here, right? You go for a full nation-building mission, and you still haven't accomplished goal number one on your list. And really the point is here that Omar bin Laden couldn't have heard this from any other place, right? He learned this firsthand from Osama bin Laden. You see, son, this is what it is that I'm trying to do. It's essentially straight out of the horse's mouth. When Osama bin Laden saw Bush come out in the Florida recount of 2000, he was elated because Bush is obviously a big, fake, tough guy, right? The kind of guy who, if you give him a crisis to exploit, he'll exploit it. And saw, at the time, this is one of the reasons that people became such 9/11 truthers too, was because our government essentially conflated Al-Qaeda with the Taliban and said that a bunch of cavemen did it. And that didn't sound very plausible, but Al-Qaeda weren't cavemen. Bin Laden was the son of a billionaire. The Bin Laden family runs essentially the Halliburton of Saudi Arabia, a major construction firm. They're, not princes, but just below that in terms of social class. And Ayman al-Zawahiri, who's the current leader of Al-Qaeda, was a prominent surgeon from Cairo, Egypt. These guys were not dummies. They were, sophisticated in the world and understood that what the Republicans need is a crisis to exploit. And then they will be, so in other words, sometimes people say that I'm arguing that poor innocent George Bush was tricked into this, but that's not really right. It's narrow-minded, cynical George Bush exploited the opportunity that the enemy had laid out for him that was, in fact, a trap. That was, in fact, the same thing that the Carter administration had sprung on the Soviet Union, and for the very same purpose. All right, now, before we get to Iraq War II, we got to talk about the neoconservatives. While they were out of power in the 1990s, they essentially coalesced all around the think tanks, most famously the American Enterprise Institute and the Project for a New American Century. But one of the, I guess more important, but maybe not as famous neoconservatives is a man named David Wurmser. And he ended up being a foreign policy advisor, Middle East advisor to Dick Cheney in the vice president's office in the W. Bush years. Well, in 1996, he wrote a paper for then incoming Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu called A Clean Break, a new strategy for securing the realm. And with it is a companion piece called Coping with Crumbling States. And then finally, he wrote a book in 1999 called Tyranny's Ally, America's Failure to Remove Saddam Hussein. And if you have the stomach for it and you read all through this, what you find is essentially the neoconservative scheme for remaking the Middle East. And it goes something like this, and if this doesn't make sense to you, it's not really because of how confusing it is, it's because this doesn't make any sense, okay? But this is what they believed. They said the problem in the Middle East for Israel is that Iran supports Hezbollah in southern Lebanon by way of Syria. And that's what we need to stop. And so in order to do that, we want to focus on removing Saddam Hussein from power in Iraq. Well, how's that supposed to work? Seems like he's the Sunni dictator, the secular dictator, who's standing as the roadblock on the path between Tehran and Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. So do tell, neocons. Well, it's like this, see? When we get rid of Saddam Hussein, we'll replace him with a cousin of the king of Jordan. And he's a Hashemite. And the Shiites, well, they just love being told what to do by anyone who claims to be the descendant of the Prophet Muhammad. Well, That's not true. And the Shiites do revere a certain line of the family, and that is part of the split between the Sunnis and the Shiites. But the Hashemites are on the other side of that line. They claim to be descended from the Prophet Muhammad, but they're Sunnis, not Shiites. And in fact, when the British had installed a Hashemite king over Iraq in the 1920s, there was a religious fatwa against him by the Shiite clergy that forbid anyone from participating or dealing in any way with the Hashemite king. But David Wormser doesn't like history so much. He just had an agenda, and he'd been convinced. And if we get rid of Saddam Hussein, the Jordanians will be dominant in Iraq, and then they will make the Shiite clergy in Iraq order Hezbollah to stop being friends with Iran and instead do what they say and be friends with Israel and do whatever Turkey and Jordan and Israel say. Well, this is completely stupid and crazy and wrong, and it's not at all how the war worked out. But that's why the neocons lied us into war, is they thought it would weaken Iran's influence over Hezbollah. And no, that's not how they sold it. You might remember it was Saddam Hussein is going to give a nuclear bomb to Al-Qaeda that they're going to use to kill you in your hometown if we don't stop them first, was what they said. But they knew that that wasn't true. And I document in the book how much they knew about the lack of weapons of mass destruction and ties to Al-Qaeda. And I'll just sum it up by saying the head of the foreign ministry and the head of Iraqi intelligence were both CIA assets. Sabri and Halbush both. And they both told the Bush government everything that they knew, which was we got nothing and we got no ties to Osama, swear to God. And they knew that, and we didn't find that out for about 3 years. And that was just the most blatant part of it. But all of it was a bunch of crock, and they knew it. And I go through Bush and Cheney and Rumsfeld's motives for the war as well. But that was the strategy behind it in the Middle East, was the neoconservative plan. And of course, the plan completely backfired. And so I'll skip letting Osama bin Laden escape in Afghanistan, because I've learned from giving this speech a few times that I just don't have time for that. But it's in both books. It's in Fool's Errand and in Enough Already, that the Delta Force and the CIA were just absolutely besides themselves, demanding, and even in their words, begging for reinforcements from the Rangers and the Green Berets and even the Marines, and were denied over and over for weeks while they were allowed to escape. And then Delta and the CIA were banned from following them into Pakistan and attempting to catch them then. And it was pretty obvious that the reason why was because the Bush government wanted to keep Osama bin Laden out there as a threat, as an Emmanuel Goldstein enemy type figure, like in the book 1984. The enemy, the wrecker, the demon, he's out there somewhere, but we don't know. So since we don't know, that means he could strike at any time, and you better stay afraid. And you can't let your fear get ratcheted down for another year and a half. And we're going to keep it like this. Orange alert on TV. And as George W. Bush said over and over again, imagine the September 11th attack, only this time with weapons of mass destruction. And to get the American people to conflate Iraq and that fear of Al-Qaeda with Saddam. Now, who cares if Saddam is friends with Osama if Osama's already dead and the American people already feel like justice has been done, revenge has been taken, and the war's over? It just didn't make any sense to kill him. It made more sense to let him go. As the Delta Force commander on scene put it, we just couldn't understand it. Why we couldn't have our reinforcements, that's why. And then they went to Iraq, and when they implemented the neocons' plan in Iraq, of course, everything went completely to hell, because the Iraqi Shiite supermajority essentially took over the capital city. W. Bush picked up right where his father had left off when he betrayed the uprising in 1991. And Junior completed their revolution. And in fact, the Supreme Islamic Council changed their name from the Supreme Council for Islamic Revolution in Iraq to just the Supreme Iraqi Islamic Council, because Bush won their revolution for them. And in January of 2004, the Ayatollah Ali al-Sistani, the highest-ranking Shiite cleric in the world, said, if you believe in God, I need you to go outside and tell George Bush you want one man, one vote. He promised us democracy. We want democracy. And then Bush was in the position at that point of essentially asking his staff, do we want to start this war all over again against the people who have thus far stood back and watched as we got rid of Saddam Hussein for them? And the answer was, no, we don't. We can't. What are we going to do? So at that point, they could either just pack up and leave and admit they'd screwed up, or they could try to make the best of it and try to figure out a way to make these Iraqi Shiite factions more dependent on them than Iran. We have more money and more weapons than Iran, but Iran has, religious and ethnic and historical kinship, and they're the next door neighbor. And so it was a race to see if somehow we could make them more dependent on us than Iran, and that didn't work. By the end of 2005, and America really spent that 5 years of that war. Everybody knows that Iraq War II was bad. Everybody knows it didn't work in whatever sense it might have been supposed to work. But they never told us, did they, that here's who's who. Here's who's fighting on whose side. And this militia that we're turning into the army, here's what their agenda is. They never said that. It was always, well, it's the Americans and the Iraqi people versus the terrorists who are trying to thwart democracy, right? So you never got to hear who's on whose side. But essentially what happened was America fought a 5-year civil war for the Shiite side. And they finished the sectarian cleansing of Baghdad to where it's now 85 to 90% Shiite city. And they couldn't undo that. Short of just admitting defeat and calling it off, they essentially decided they had to see that process through. But then Zalmay Khalilzad and Elliott Abrams, two very influential neoconservatives, essentially came to Bush and said, we really screwed up. Okay, there's no way, we got to admit to ourselves. We have put Iran's friends in power here. Iran is, almost certainly going to have more influence over them than we are for the long term. And now, so what are we going to do about it? And the answer was whatever the king of Saudi Arabia says. And Zalmay Khalilzad, it's in the WikiLeaks, thanks to Chelsea Manning and Julian Assange, who's rotting in solitary confinement right now, by the way, that Zalmay Khalilzad went and met with the Saudi king. And the Saudi king said, I don't understand. It was always you and us and Saddam Hussein against Iran. Now you have handed Iraq to Iran on a golden platter. We have silver platters. They have golden platters there. Rich royalty guys, They have solid gold airplanes. Why not golden platters? But anyway, so Khalilzad says, you're right, and I'm sorry. And we're at your service, your highness. And so that's the beginning of the policy of the redirection, where the Bush team, the change didn't come with Bush turning to Obama. The change came during W. Bush. We screwed up. We fought Iraq War II for Iran. Now we're tilting back toward our Sunni alliance in the region to try to make it up to them. And then, of course, because the neoconservatives were still dominant at the time, the policy was to start backing bin Ladenite groups like Fatah al-Islam in Lebanon against Hezbollah, the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood, which is much more radical and bin Ladenite than, say, for example, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt is, or in Qatar where they sit in the parliament. In Syria, they're much more like bin Ladenite radicals. And then they also backed a group called Jandala, who are a really dangerous bin Ladenite group in Iran, head chopper, suicide bomber, murderer types. And the Americans and the Israelis both started backing this group, Jandala. And this was the time also that they tried what was called the awakening in Iraq. Because when America had taken the side of the Shiites in the Civil War, they had pushed the Sunnis into the arms of the bin Ladenites. And you had foreign fighters from our allies in Saudi Arabia and from Libya, from Syria, and around the Middle East who had gone to Iraq like it was Afghanistan in the 80s to fight against the Americans and the Shiites. And so what they did was, really, it started in 2005 when the local Iraqi tribal leaders started turning on these al-Qaeda guys and killing them because they were sick of being told what to do by a bunch of Saudis and Egyptians who weren't from there and had no business, trying to lord over them. So they started turning on them. And then when Petraeus launched the surge, he essentially raced to get ahead of that parade. And he bribed the Sunni tribes to turn on the al-Qaeda guys. As long as you won't attack us and you will target the worst of the bin Ladenites, then we'll let you keep your weapons and we'll give you money and big promises that they'll be integrated into the Iraqi government, which of course never happened. But that was the stroke of luck. It's like a miracle, really, that for years, something like 5 years, America had turned all of Western Iraq into bin Laden University, with radical Sunni bin Ladenites from across the region coming there to fight and, battle-hardened tactics and going through torture and all of the rest of this. And then, like a miracle, just a stroke of luck, the local Sunni, not the Shiites we were fighting for, not the American GIs, the local Sunni tribal population that the bin Ladenites were fighting for, turned on them and stabbed them in the back and got rid of them for us and for humanity, just killed them by the thousands and reduced their numbers down to extremely low hundreds. Essentially, Al-Qaeda in Iraq was this huge bubble and blip and then was gone. Thank goodness. All right. But then the Shiites told Bush, sign on the dotted line and get the hell out. Thanks for putting us in power. Now don't let the door hit you in the ass on the way, because we don't need you anymore. Bye. And Bush, it was 2008, last year of his presidency, he had no choice. Time was running out. He signed on the dotted line. We'll be out by 2011. All right. So now Barack Obama comes in. And the first thing he does, of course, is launch the massive Afghan surge for political reasons. He knew it would fail. He knew it couldn't possibly win, but they were, as David Petraeus put it, they're adding time to the Washington clock. And punt the ball down the field, let it go a little bit longer, refuse to admit defeat, because that would be bad politics. You can't be soft on the terrorist enemy. There's that. And as bad as that was, and as bad as the drone war that he started in Pakistan and in Yemen were, and the air war that he escalated in Afghanistan, for that matter, far worse was when Obama picked up the redirection policy of W. Bush and launched it against Libya in the Arab Spring, and then took it to Syria. Now, Libya was a big favor to the Saudis, but they're not allied with the Shiite Iranians. They're just were longtime, opponents of the Sauds, and had screwed them over on oil deals, and there was bitter resentment over accusations over the Saudis betraying the Palestinians, and I guess Gaddafi would make fun of them for wearing dresses like women, for their white flowing robes and that kind of thing. So they were happy to get their revenge and hire the Americans and the Europeans to take out Gaddafi for them. But then the most important consequence of that, of course, is that they took that war was really fought for the Libyan veterans of Iraq War II, who had come home to Libya to try to start the revolution there. And instead of allying with Gaddafi against them, as W. Bush had done, Obama, just as he's killing Osama in the spring of 2011, is taking bin Laden's side in North Africa in this war against Muammar Gaddafi. And he was backing the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, Ansar al-Sharia, and the Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, which is an Algerian-based group. And these were some of the major beneficiaries of the war in Libya, which the civil war there in the aftermath continues to this day. It's a complete hellhole because of that. As Obama himself said, he called it a shit show. But then he said, it was the worst mistake of my presidency that I didn't send the army and the State Department to build a new state for the people of Libya after we had destroyed their last one. Yeah, thanks. Yeah. If only he had done in Libya what Bush had done in Iraq, it would have worked as well as the war in Iraq, right? What's the problem there with that logic? But then worse, they sent the Mujahideen and the guns off to the war in Syria. And this is essentially the redirection in practice, making it up to the Sunni alliance that we had handed Baghdad over to the Shiites. And so Jeffrey Goldberg, for example, asked Barack Obama in the spring of 2012 in the Atlantic magazine, hey, don't you think that if we got rid of Assad in Syria, that would really help bring Iran down a peg? And Obama says, absolutely. And Goldberg says, well, so what are we doing about that? Because, it seems like the revolution's been going on for quite a few months now, and he doesn't seem to be leaving power. What can you do to speed this up? And Obama says, well, I could tell you, Jeffrey, but your clearance isn't high enough. In other words, a less funny version of I'd tell you, but I'd have to kill you, right? Because In other words, there already was a covert action program on the ground in Syria, and as we had already known for a year. And in fact, the first person who wrote about it was one of Dick Cheney's neoconservatives from the W. Bush years, John Hanna, wrote a piece in Foreign Policy in April of 2011 saying that Prince Bandar bin Sultan in Saudi Arabia has just come back to power, or he had been the ambassador, and he is now the head of intelligence, and he's sending fighters off to Syria. What does that mean? That means Al-Qaeda guys. That means bin Ladenites sprung from prison and sent off to go be suicide bombers. And that was in April of 2011, the dawn of the Arab Spring, just 6-8 weeks into the start of the thing. And then, at antiwar.com, that's our job. We keep track. So it was all through the summer. Alistair Crook at The Observer talked about this going on. And my good friend Eric Margolis, the international war correspondent, had gone to France and had learned that French special forces and British and Americans were all training these guys in Lebanon and sending them in to fight and beginning to train them in Turkey. And of course, you can read in Stratfor, again, the WikiLeaks. Thank you to Julian Assange for posting all that stuff. And you can read in there that in December of 2011, before the end of the year, that they said Barack Obama has signed a finding authorizing new covert action in Syria. And again, in support of a revolution that, as we knew at the time and that whole year long, was being led by bin Ladenites. Essentially, the same guys that were the bad guys in the last war, Al-Qaeda in Iraq and Iraq War II, are now being sold to us as the moderate rebels in Syria. And Hillary Clinton herself knew this and admitted it on camera as early as the end of February of 2012, because she was asked on CBS News, why aren't we doing enough to get rid of Assad? And by the way, this was just 3 days after she had met with the so-called, Syrian National Council that was supposed to take over as the new interim government, and she found them sorely lacking in the ability to do so. And so when she's asked by the CBS reporter, she says, well, we know that Zawahiri has endorsed the revolution in Syria. Are we supporting Al-Qaeda in Syria? And we know that the reason she said that is because just a couple of days before, her aide, Jake Sullivan, who is currently the national security advisor to Joe Biden, had sent her an email that says, hey, guess what, boss? AQ is on our side in Syria. And it had attached to it a Reuters story about Zawahiri endorsing the revolution there. And so she was right. Now, if you forced her to answer for that, she would say, look, we didn't want to back the terrorists. We knew that there were terrorists. That's why we were trying to back the moderates. And her narrative was, if only she could get Obama to double and triple down on support for the moderates, then they would marginalize the extremists and then everything would be fine. But that's just a load of crap. Because, in fact, Al-Qaeda in Iraq had started coming across the border from Iraq as soon as the thing had broke out. And they renamed their group Al-Nusra, Jabhat al-Nusra, the Association of Helpers or something close to that. And they had been the dominant force on the battlefield the whole time, and every bit of money and weapons that the CIA, the Saudis, the Qataris, the Turks, and the Israelis were giving to these guys the whole time, it was all going to the extremists, the guys that fight the hardest, the guys who don't mind dying. They're the ones out there leading the revolution. And the idea, Barack Obama himself later told Thomas Friedman of the New York Times, the idea that we could create an army of moderates that was going to be able to take on all comers, Assad and Hezbollah and Iran on that side before Russia even intervened, and also Al-Qaeda and ISIS and all the extremists on the other side, and that we were going to build this army out of doctors and pharmacists and teachers and people from the neighborhood. He said that was always a fantasy. A fantasy. That's Barack Obama's own words. And yet, what did he do? He authorized support for this fantasy, which in practice actually meant arming bin Laden's men. Bin Laden and Zawahiri's men. And now, in the spring of 2013, the Iraqi-dominated faction of Al-Qaeda in Iraq split from the Syrian-dominated faction of Al-Qaeda in Iraq and decided to declare a state now. The Al-Qaeda goal had been, remember, to lure the Americans into the Middle East, to bog us down, to bleed us to bankruptcy, destabilize the region, force us out the long and the hard way. Only then could they have their local revolutions and succeed. But this guy, Baghdadi, the leader of the Iraqi-dominated faction of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, I guess figured, well, since America's on our side in this one, hey, look, USA's on our side in this one. He said, well, maybe I'll go ahead and have my caliphate now. And so in 2013, they seized the city of Raqqa and declared an Islamic State. And 1 year later, they rolled right into western Iraq, which was essentially wide open. The Shiite chauvinists America had empowered in Baghdad didn't really care to try to rule over the Sunnis, but essentially had just cut them loose. And so ISIS rolled in and conquered Mosul and Fallujah and Tikrit and Ramadi. Well, it took them a little while to get Ramadi, but Samarra. They essentially conquered all of western Iraq within a few weeks. And then that necessitated, you might remember, they waited a little while until they really need us. It was they created the caliphate in June, and it wasn't until the beginning of August that Barack Obama then finally launched Iraq War III to support the Shiites that they wished that they hadn't fought Iraq War II for, to destroy the Islamic State that they had built up to spite these Shiites because they wished they hadn't fought Iraq War II for them. And so then that was what they did. And America found themselves back on the side of Iran and Iran's friends in destroying the Islamic State. And then that's where our people remain today on the border region between Iraq and Syria there. Now, back to bin Laden's goals. You know, this guy wanted to see the entire region destabilized. He wanted to see America bled to bankruptcy and our hegemony over the region destroyed. They wanted to see the sock puppet dictators destabilized. They wanted to see the populations of the Middle East radicalized in terms of religion and politics, and they got all that. Now, America didn't make bin Laden the king of Saudi Arabia, and Zawahiri still doesn't sit on the throne in Cairo, but we got rid of Saddam, Gaddafi, almost got rid of Assad for him. And right now, to this day, America is fighting a war for Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, the guys that bombed the Khobar Towers, the guys that bombed the USS Cole, the guys that helped coordinate the September 11th attack, the guys that did the Charlie Hebdo attack and the Nice attacks in France, real Al-Qaeda guys. Not, oh, they have links to Al-Qaeda. Real Al-Qaeda guys who have shed innocent American blood. And America, again, because of Barack Obama and this chapter of the war in Yemen that he started 6 years ago in the spring of 2015, America has been fighting a war, again, just like in Syria and in Libya, directly on behalf of the veterans of Iraq War II. Real Al-Qaeda dating back to old, what they call core Al-Qaeda, bin Laden and Zawahiri, and also the veterans of Iraq War II who came from Yemen and then came home again. And when we're fighting for them and their alliance with UAE and Saudi, why? Because a group of Shiites have taken over the capital city, the Houthis. And then what's really not true, but the Saudi accusation is that then makes them the puppets of Iran, and it's intolerable that Iran would have a beachhead in the southwestern corner of the Arabian Peninsula, and so America has to fight them. Now, the Americans didn't even buy this line of argument when they launched the war. Instead, Obama was in the middle of negotiating the Iran nuclear deal, and the Saudis were mad about that. Now, you might think, why would the Saudis be mad that Obama is signing a deal that locks down Iran's civilian nuclear program far more than any nuclear program in the history of the world, and convincing them to pour concrete into their heavy water reactor and all of these things? Well, the answer is because Iran never was making a bomb in the first place. All that was a hoax, and the deal was completely superfluous. We already had the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and the threat was a hoax. So Saudi was never worried that Iran was making a bomb. But they were worried that if we made this new nuclear deal with Iran, and taking all those sanctions off the table, that threatened real normalization of relations between America and Iran, and that they feared America would start tilting back toward Iran, and that would threaten Saudi Arabia's place as top of the pile in America's dominated order in the Middle East. And so to be reassured, they demanded that America launch the genocide in Yemen for them. And that's exactly what it is, by the way. It's a medieval-style siege campaign. 1 million people died in Iraq War II, probably 500,000 in Syria, somewhere like 500,000 in the war in Afghanistan over the last 20 years. And it's a hell of a lot of collateral damage. But at no time that I'm aware of were the Americans under Bush and Obama in any of the wars that I just mentioned, the drone war in Pakistan too, where they're deliberately trying to kill civilians in large numbers. That just hasn't been the policy, okay? The people die as the result of the war, absolutely. But in the war in Yemen, murdering the civilian population is the policy. It's what it's all about. And they diffuse the responsibility and say, oh, well, no, it's the Saudi-led coalition, except that America is the world empire and Saudi Arabia is our client state. And they're flying American F-15s and they're dropping American bombs made by Lockheed and Raytheon. They also are flying British Typhoons and dropping bombs made by the BAE systems at the same time. The French also support them. But they call it the Saudi-led coalition, as Obama called it, leading from behind. So we get to have our war, but we get to pretend that it's not our war, it's somebody else's. But that's not fooling the people of Yemen. They call it the American-Saudi war, because that's exactly what it is. And the policy from the very beginning has been to bomb the waterworks, the electricity, the farms, and when I say the farms, I mean the grain silos, the flocks of sheep in the field, the horses in their stables, all the trucks and tractors, the irrigation systems. They bomb the fishermen in their boats. They bomb all the marketplaces, any auto dealership, any trucks for distribution. They bombed the cholera hospitals in the middle of the worst cholera outbreaks in recorded history, which means worse than when the United Nations gave it to the Haitians, and means worse than when H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton deliberately inflicted cholera on the people of Iraq during the sanctions regime in Iraq War 1.5. It was the worst cholera outbreaks in recorded history, and then the Americans and Saudis come by and bomb the damn hospital, where little babies are dying of dehydration, meaning they're defecating and vomiting themselves to death. And it's USA's responsible for every bit of that against a country, not against Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, who have attacked us at least, but against a country, a nation, a population, and a political faction in power that never threatened us in any way whatsoever, much less actually inflicted harm on us in any way whatsoever. And as of 2.5 years ago, the UN's official death count was 250,000 dead. And I guarantee by the end of this thing, when they do the excess death rate count, it's going to be more than 1 million Yemenis have died in this thing, most of them children under 5. And again, why? A war of genocide and treason for Al-Qaeda against little babies? For what purpose again? Because they're angry that they empowered Iran in Iraq War II. They gave Baghdad to Tehran, and they're trying to make up for it. And they prefer our enemies, Al-Qaeda, who they created for us in the first place, but have shed innocent American blood and American combatant soldiers' blood as well. And our government prefers our enemies to their strategic rivals in the region, Iran, which declared independence from them in 1979. And they can't get over that. And so they're willing to betray the American people, betray the American soldiers on all sides of this war, and betray the civilian populations of the Middle East, who at least they stop claiming they care about anymore, in order to accomplish essentially nothing, except all actions contrary to their own stated goals the entire time. And so then, it should not go without saying here that, of course, Donald Trump continued all of these policies for 4 years straight. He wanted out of Afghanistan. Instead, he escalated. He sent 10,000 more men and massively escalated the air war, killing tens of thousands of people and accomplishing absolutely nothing. Although by the end of it, he did sign a withdrawal deal, and really did sign a withdrawal deal promising to get American troops out by May of this year, a deadline which Biden, of course, blew. But it does seem like America really is on the track to pull military resources out of Afghanistan now. They've already given up the Kandahar Air Base, and they're closing down Bagram. I would have never believed it. They're closing down the Bagram Air Base right now, and they're saying that they want to leave CIA and that they want to have an air base in Pakistan where they can still do cross-border raids. But essentially they want to have it both ways, so we'll see how it goes. But they are essentially, it seems to be, calling it quits on the mission of supporting the longevity of the Afghan government, whose days then are absolutely numbered. And so we'll see how that goes. But the fighting this year has been absolutely terrible and promises only to get worse there. But It seems like that war finally is winding down. We still have troops occupying the oil and wheat fields in eastern Syria to keep them hands out of the regime there, and a massive sanctions and blockade regime against the people of Syria who are suffering terribly under it and refusing to allow Assad and his government to rebuild the country that the United States destroyed there. And they still have troops in western Iraq, which Donald Trump said, yeah, we're there to fight ISIS, but not really. We're there to keep an eye on Iran. And in fact, you'll remember that in the end of 2019, beginning of 2020, there was a rocket attack against the Americans, and then the Americans blamed it on a group called Kataib Hezbollah, an Iraqi group that they said, and then they blamed it on Iran for doing it, and that led to an attack on the Kataib Hezbollah base, and then a protest at the American embassy in the Green Zone, and then culminated in Donald Trump's drone strike against Qasem Soleimani, who is the leader of the Iranian Quds Force, and almost led to a war, but miraculously Donald Trump allowed the Ayatollah to get the last word, and he targeted an empty corner of an American military base in Iraq for a missile barrage. And some guys actually did have some traumatic brain injury from that, but nobody was killed in the thing, and thank goodness that Donald Trump let that die where it was. But I just want to point out how, from the point of view, first of all, we don't know who really did that rocket attack. And I interviewed an Iraqi journalist, and even the New York Times admitted that we don't really know who did this. They found a pickup truck with an empty Katyusha rocket launcher in the back of it, but they don't know who was driving it or who fired those rockets. And in that part of Iraq, I was told by an Iraqi journalist that I interviewed, it could have been anybody. And so think then of the incentive that what's left of ISIS that they have to do a rocket attack on Americans and try to frame Shiite militias for it, to try to drive a wedge between their worst enemies, the Americans and the Iranian-backed Shiite forces there. So we could get lured into a war with Iran and Iran-friendly forces in Iraq by an al-Qaeda false flag. Our forces are primed for that right now. And that's essentially where it stands. I guess I'll say one more thing about Yemen, which is the Biden promised to end it in the campaign. And then in early February, he announced that he was ending all American support for the Saudi war. No more refueling of or resupply of their bombs, no more maintenance for their planes, no more logistics, and no more intelligence for the targeting. We are begging out of the offensive war against Yemen. Will only provide defensive support for their efforts to keep the Houthis from attacking them across the border with missiles, Patriot missiles and Iron Dome type tech, but no more offensive support. But then at the beginning of last month, the beginning of May, or I'm sorry, it may have been April, I'm pretty sure it was at the beginning of May, Admiral Kirby, the spokesman for the Pentagon, admitted that actually we're still providing them with maintenance support for their Air Force. And so then as far as we know, that means that they're still supplying, they've authorized the contractors to continue with the logistics and the intelligence and all of the resupply and all of the rest of it too. So it's going to take a real push. And listen, no one speaks for the Yemenis. There's a very small Yemeni peace lobby here, but it's just regular people. It's not Yemeni business interests or any kind of powerful faction. It's just regular Yemeni Americans who are leading this with the help of the Quakers and other groups. And it's totally been, from the get-go, absolute bottom-up grassroots effort by activists to bring this issue to the attention of the Congress and to try to get them to force the issue. And that's what it's going to take to get the issue forced and to get that war ended. And then just real quick here at the end, I think you guys already know about the consequences for the American people. You've been living through it. Those of you who have friends and family who've been to the wars and back, what are the chances that they still believe in it? According to the polls, very little, very low. I know, I'm the guy from antiwar.com, and I know that a significant minority of my audience are anti-war veterans, and they're very loud about it. And they're very certain about opposing what they've been through and trying to prevent other young men from having to have their lives wasted in the same way. And we all know that they've blown about $7 trillion, but the opportunity costs are essentially limitless. If you think of what could have been done instead, if the terror war had been ended by the end of 2001 and the $7 trillion had been invested in productive uses, and all those engineers and all those fighting aged males had gone to work producing goods and services in the free market. You're talking tens and tens of trillions of dollars in opportunity cost lost. And then really worst of all, and this is a subject that's important to all of us as libertarians, is the Austrian school explanation of the boom and the bust cycle, the horrible business cycle that pulls the rug out from under all Americans, and for that matter, all earthlings, every 10 or 12 years or so, which is generated by our artificially low interest rates and easy money policy governed by the American Federal Reserve System, which is all made to make the world empire seem free. If they raised your taxes for these wars, you'd fight. You wouldn't let them do it. But instead, they inflate and inflate. Remember, Bush sent out $200 and $300 checks in the mail at IRS time, like that was your dividend from all the profits from the war in Iraq. When instead what he was doing was just sinking money into a black hole, sinking wealth into a black hole. And then when the crash of '08 came, everybody is mourning their next door neighbor who blew his brains out, and they're standing staring at their shoes in the unemployment line, and they don't realize this is your share of the cost of killing all those Iraqis. That's what it costs you. And so this is the destabilization of our entire society that comes from waging these wars. It necessitates the easy money policy that causes these horrible boom and bust cycles and does so much to disrupt American, political society and everything else in that way, and has helped to drive such a partisan wedge between the two sides in America. And then, of course, all of Homeland Security, the militarization of the police. You wonder where your deputy sheriff got his MRAP, armored personnel carrier. Well, they didn't even start making those things until halfway through Iraq War II. And you got Reaper and Predator drones flying over your cities. You have the FBI and CIA using their foreign intelligence powers against the American people, of course the NSA too. All of this is a consequence of the war on terrorism. And it doesn't have to be this way. It never did have to be this way. And it's time for us to finally admit that and end the war on terrorism. Thank you. Thanks, you guys. Thank you.